Hi, my name is David Bose. I am the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy on the Go, and welcome to this episode. I got to warn you right off the bat, there's a little bit of, there's some wind damage and construction in my area. So if you hear something that sounds like the mating call of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, that is some of the impact wrenches and drilling going on in the wall directly in front of me. So bear with that, and I'll try and mute my microphone whenever possible to kind of cover for that. And I'll remind some of the newcomers in a couple of minutes why those noises are happening. Also, be sure to check out our blog at washingtonpolicy.org for the latest updates on state policy in all of our research areas. It's got key information that you need to know, and you need to share with your friends and neighbors and let them know as well. It is shocking to find so many people throughout the state that still don't know about Washington Policy Center and about this information. I see it all the time on Facebook and other social media where people are surprised. We need to do a better job at sharing that and getting that out there and making sure that people know what's happening, why it's happening, and what the alternatives are. And Washington Policy Center does a great job providing you that information. Now, for those of you who are new to Washington Policy on the Go, just remember, we'll talk with each center director, and then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. You can enter your questions at any time in the Q&A tool on Zoom. We try and get to every question that's asked. We usually succeed. And then if there are any available, usually the center directors come back and try and deal with those individually. So feel free at any time to put your question in the Q&A section. Some of you prefer the chat method. I do try and check the chat, but it's harder scrolling up and down to find those questions and isolate them as I'm moderating the panel. So if you could just make sure that you move those into the Q&A box, that'll be helpful. Today, we're going to talk with Todd Myers. He is our Center for the Environment Director. We'll talk with him about some of Governor Inslee's vetoes, among other things. But we're going to start with our Center for Government Reform Director, Jason Mercier, about the latest on the income tax and some of the state official attempts at keeping it going, despite the Superior Court ruling that determined not only was the new capital gains income tax an income tax, as we've been saying all along, and the IRS has been saying, and all the other revenue departments of all 49 other states have been saying, but we also got the ruling that it was unconstitutional in Washington State as well. Jason, you want to describe for us why it's why the court ruled that it was unconstitutional very quickly, just as a refresher for those who are new?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So if you look at our Constitution, you're not going to see income tax anywhere. What you're going to see is the broadest definition of property of any state constitution. And that was actually added by the voters as a constitutional amendment. It says property is everything subject to ownership, whether tangible or intangible. So basically, if you own your income, it's property. And the reason that matters for the income tax debate, Washington's Constitution restricts property taxes to be uniform and no more than 1% of its value. So you can have a flat 1% income tax. Often I hear an income tax is unconstitutional. That's not true, just a graduated. You can't have that graduated income tax. So what does this have to do with the rulings? Well, since the Supreme Court has said that you own your income, and we know that we have the property tax restrictions, Washingtonians have been sent 6 constitutional amendments to do what Oregon and California do. And we have said every single time, 60, 70%, no, we don't want a graduated income tax. So the legislature got creative and they tried to play a game and called an income tax an excise tax. And that's where the court just issued the ruling.
And now that ruling occurred, what's the state response been as far as getting prepared to implement the state income tax?
The state's response is the heads are buried very deeply in the sand, trying to pretend that they did not hear the Inslee appointed judge unequivocally say, this is unconstitutional, this is void, this is invalid, this is inoperable as a matter of law. So, that was a pretty unclear ruling. It's really hard to decipher what the judge has said when he said all of those things very clearly that it's unconstitutional. But the response has been just to carry forward as if this judge did not rule. We know the Department of Revenue is continuing with its rulemaking, and I actually reached out to them and I said, in light of this ruling, saying that this is an unconstitutional, invalid income tax, what are your plans if this is still going through the appellate process next year when the tax is owed? Are you still going to require Washingtonians to submit an unconstitutional income tax? And the answer was basically, we don't know yet. We haven't made that decision, which is shocking. right? This ruling was not stayed. This ruling is in effect. This judge has said this is unconstitutional, and they're just moving forward as if it hasn't happened yet. And that continues, unfortunately, to some other nonpartisan entities. We have a really good revenue forecast process, nonpartisan, Republicans and Democrats, but it's also staffed by some of the agencies underneath the governor's control, the Office of Financial Management, the Department of Revenue. And they met a couple of weeks ago because their staff saw this court ruling saying this tax was ruled unconstitutional. And the staff asked the members, what do you want us to do? This court says this is unconstitutional, it's invalid. Do you want us to take that revenue off of our balance sheet, off of our revenue forecast? Or do you want us to assume that we're going to keep collecting it? Now, Representative Orcutt, one of the Republicans, made the motion, well, let's do what the judge said. The judge said it's unconstitutional, let's stop assuming it. He was overruled, however, by Senator Rolfes, the Office of Financial Management, and the state treasurer all said, no, let's just keep assuming we're going to collect this revenue. So why does that matter? Well, it matters because something else that we'll get to in a few minutes, there's a ballot measure out there, and there's a new law the legislature passed this year on ballot titles to try to scare voters away from cutting taxes. And if the state of Washington is going to be pretending this ruling doesn't exist, that does not give us a lot of hope of what that ballot title is going to look like.
And what's the law on that? Or do you know? I mean, I know you're not an attorney, Jason, but it still strikes me as strange that they can spend state money and resources and manpower, forgive that lack of woke terminology, but person power to implement something that was just ruled an unconstitutional violation of the law. It seems strange to me.
Well, obviously, the Attorney General has appealed this, and he wants to skip the Court of Appeals and go directly to the Supreme Court. But we could be June or July till we know, even if the Supreme Court wants to take this, or they're going to kick it back to the appellate court. So that's just a long way of saying we could be still years in the appeals process. This tax, if the law had remained in effect, is subject to this year's income. It's due next April. So you would assume with a judge ruling the tax is inoperable, that the revenue department would not be assuming they're going to collect this tax. The judge did not stay his ruling. It's in effect. But now you've got the situation, though, where they're still moving forward as if that ruling doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's what's throwing me off there. It'd be one thing if they said, well, this thing, there's no enforcement of this until we get a decision later, but that's not the case. And with all the crazy financial things happening and inflation so high and the economic uncertainty ahead, it seems like a good time, to at least err on the side of caution for the state.
We'll just acknowledge you laid it out in your introduction, right? This was the IRS. This is 49 states. This is every other country in the world. And now this is an Inslee appointed judge, all in harmony. This is an income tax. And despite that, we already mentioned how the Department of Revenue is just moving toward the rulemaking. That's still going to be assumed in the revenue forecast. But there was another thing that, I shouldn't be surprised anymore, but I was surprised by it. A ballot measure has been filed. It's Initiative 1929. It's probably the cleanest, simplest ballot measure you will ever see. It's one page. And all it does is repeal the bill the legislature passed last year, Senate Bill 5096, the capital gains income tax, just repeals that bill. Now, they're doing this because they're not sure what the Supreme Court's going to do with this case. This is kind of an insurance thing in case our court somehow decides that you don't own your income anymore. But what is interesting about this was filed after the Douglas County Superior Court ruled this was an unconstitutional income tax. So your expectation would be when the Attorney General writes the nonpartisan, unbalanced ballot title and summary, he would take that court ruling into effect. He didn't. The ballot title still calls this an excise tax. The summary still calls this an excise tax. And now, because of this, the 1929 campaign just yesterday filed a ballot title challenge and pointed out to Thurston County Superior Court, which is where this ballot title challenge is going to be heard in the coming week, that the IRS, every other state, and the Inslee appointed judge in Douglas County have all said this is an income tax. The Attorney General is misleading the voters.
Yeah, I had a beef with how even the media covered it when it was covered as an excise tax before, because like you say, with the IRS, usually that alone is enough, right? When the IRS says something's a tax, if an income tax, most media sources would say, hey, that's enough right there. You have all kinds of people running around saying that we don't really have an income tax, but generally, the media will go, okay, the IRS says so. You're going to be arrested if you don't pay. This is an income tax, And then when it came to this particular measure, despite the IRS and your work showing that the revenue departments of every other state treat capital gains taxes and income taxes, it was still described in the media as an excise tax. The reason why was because the proponents said it was, and then the behind the scenes emails show that the whole purpose of it is to get an income tax. So it seems to me that the courts are doing that now. This is the mating call of the Tyrannosaurus I was telling you about there, the construction zone. But that it's hard to get beyond that to me. And then with this 1929 campaign challenge, that's really shocking in that the traditional role has been to be nonpartisan.
Yeah, and the AG kind of complicated the ballot title because it's supposed to be only 30 words, and by trying to do this game that it's an excise tax on the sale and exchange of capital assets, he went over the 30 word limit as well. And all you have to do is just reflect what the bill itself says. The bill itself says this is a tax on the income reported to the IRS for your capital gains. You don't have to get cute. You don't have to play games. But, part of the reason why I think they're doing this, and part of the reason why I think the Department of Revenue is moving forward, and the Office of Financial Management, the Treasurer objected to removing this revenue from the revenue forecast, comes back to another bill the legislature passed this year. And they did this just to target tax cuts because they don't think Washingtonians understand what they're doing when they vote for tax cuts. So this new law that the governor signed will require in the ballot title, when you go to vote, that say everything that's going to be cut if you pass this tax, right? You're going to starve children. You hate puppies. Everything that can go wrong if you pass this tax cut. Now, if this is an income tax and it's an unconstitutional income tax, as the court has ruled, that then when that Office of Financial Management goes to evaluate 1929 and talks about all the things that's going to go away, it should be nothing, right? It's an unconstitutional tax. Nothing should go away because the tax can never be collected. But if you want to pretend that ruling never happened, then you get to put in the ballot title all the things that will be cut if you pass this unconstitutional tax.
What's the appeals process for the initiative campaign once they get a bad title like that from the Attorney General's office?
So you have 5 days after the ballot title and summary are written by the Attorney General to appeal. And that's what happened yesterday. The appeal was officially filed by the campaign. I checked with the Thurston County Superior Court clerk this morning. It has not been assigned to a judge yet, which means it doesn't have a case number and there's not a schedule. But that should happen really quickly because you have to be able to go out into the field to gather your signatures. This can't be delayed for a long period of time. But once the judge in Thurston County makes the decision, that's the end of the appeals. That's what's going to go on the ballot title.
And does the judge then create the ballot title, or does it go back to the AG's office for them to rewrite it? How does that work?
So what happens is the Attorney General's already submitted his, and in the briefing filed yesterday by the campaign, they recommended their own alternative ballot title and summary. So the judge can just say, well, this is more honest and I'm going to go with that, or no, the AG's, I'm going to go with that, or they can combine it. But whatever comes out, that's what's going to go on the ballot from the Secretary of State's office.
It's amazing, isn't it? There's a big victory, but there's always this struggle to keep this income tax dream alive in Washington State. No matter how many times the voters say no, no matter how many times the courts say no, it's just like, I think you compared it during Halloween to the serial killers in the slasher films. It's Freddy, Jason, and all of them combined. It just will not die. Sequel after sequel to this awful stuff.
Well, we did have some interesting news on the positive front in the last couple of weeks, and this is perhaps as surprising as the state officials ignoring the capital gains income tax.
Oh, good point. I would have forgotten. Yeah.
And so you may recall a few years ago, there was an effort from some Democratic lawmakers to pass a bill that they wanted to study the state's tax structure. And if this sounds like deja vu, it's because we have done this consistently. In fact, I participated in the last go round back in the early 2000s, the Bill Gates Tax Structure Commission. Right? Recommendations are made. Washingtonians look at the process, say, no, we like the way things are. Well, if you want an income tax, you need to have cover about why you should do it. So there was an effort to, let's look at it again. Let's compare our tax structure. They couldn't get the votes for this bill, though. So what they did is they stuck it into the budget as a study, as a proviso. And it's called the Washington Tax Structure Working Group. It's made up of Republicans and Democrats and a nonpartisan consultant. And you may recall, I think last year we turned over our program to the consultant to talk about what they're working on. Well, something very interesting happened a week ago, despite what I think was an effort to try to get the result they wanted, because some of these questions were kind of leading you to wanting to support an income tax. The consultant came back and said, there's no support. Cross demographics, doesn't matter about the age, it doesn't matter about the income in the household, it doesn't matter about where in the state, and it doesn't matter about the race. Washingtonians don't support an income tax. And interestingly enough, that consultant found that that opposition was stronger with what they called people of color versus whites. The people of color demographic was more opposed to an income tax than what they called the white counterparts. So this is the recommendation that the consultant was making back to this. And I got to give Senator Wellman a shout out and some credit, because she was one of the voting members on this working group. And she said that even though she supports an income tax, it's very clear the citizens don't, and it's not going anywhere. So she was one of the deciding votes a few weeks ago for this tax structure working group has officially removed. It is no longer on the table a personal, flat, or progressive income tax, a flat or progressive corporate income tax, or an employer compensation tax. All of those have been removed from the menu, which means when this working group makes their recommendations to the legislature next year, an income tax won't be one of them.
It means that also when they turned the program over to us, it was not in vain because so many of you spoke up as well during that program. And they have years to go back to the ballot and look. And Washington Policy Center we did our own poll showing clear majorities opposed to income taxes throughout the state, and we've done that a couple of times over the last few years. So that's good news. Is there there's talk of a wealth tax, Jason? What's the difference between their income tax ideas and this wealth tax that gets bandied about?
Yeah, so I mentioned they removed the income taxes and the employer compensation tax. Still on the table are some property tax changes, our actual recommendation to replace the B&O tax with a margin tax, and then the wealth tax. So, let's go back to how we started this program. Remember, property is everything subject to ownership, whether tangible or intangible. So a wealth tax would tax all that property, everything you have, tangible or intangible. And the way it's been structured in Olympia is, well, we're just going to tax billionaires. We're just going to tax the wealth for billionaires above a certain income threshold. The problem is, again, under our Constitution, you can't do that. Property taxes have to be uniform. So even though a wealth tax is still on the table, I don't think it's going to go anywhere, because to be constitutional, it would have to apply to all Washingtonians at 1%.
That sounds like it would be complicated to figure out too, if it's all categories of property. You're talking about, just because you lose so many man hours and stuff trying to figure out your income taxes as it is with the feds. I've paid state income taxes when I lived in Michigan for a time. And I can assure you, if you've not had the experience of paying both, it's not, it's not fun, it's not pleasant, and it's not great to go through 2 rounds of paperwork. So,
well, and you can imagine the complexity of having the Department of Revenue trying to estimate intangible property value.
Yeah, that's the first thing that popped in my head is what does that mean? What's it worth? And those intangible properties, those things can change really fast in a marketplace where, something intangible might be worth a lot right now. And then, the next year or in 6 months or 2 months, it's cratered. So it's hard to say. Well, Jason, thanks so much. We'll get to your questions here coming up at the end in the Q&A section. If you have a question for Jason, make sure you put it in the Q&A box, and we'll get it loaded and ready to go here at the end of the interview section. Right now, we're going to turn to our Center for the Environment Director, Todd Myers, who's here to talk a bit about Governor Inslee's made some vetoes, and he's even vetoed some really significant and popular legislation, and some legislation that, if for a guy who wants to be known as kind of the environmental governor, it comes across as a bit shocking. Tell us about these the vetoes that the governor has instituted. Let's start with on energy, Jason. I'm sorry, Todd, and what that means for the state moving forward.
Well, the state has a requirement to be carbon neutral for its electricity by the year 2030. And so what that requires is a lot more intermittence, a lot more solar, a lot more wind that you can't turn on and off. And so as demand changes during the day, you're going to put more pressure on the grid, because even though you may have enough electricity overall, if it's not timed right and you can't time it right, there's a risk to grid instability. So both parties recognize that this is a problem. They do research. So they passed a couple of bills, one a piece of legislation, another in the budget, to study what will happen in the future when we have more intermittent sources of energy on the grid, and what that will happen to grid instability. The governor vetoed all of those, said, oh, there's other agencies that look at this, so we don't need to look at that. So the legislators, they feel like they don't have the information. They're the ones who are trying to make decisions based on adequate supply of electricity in Washington state and across the region. So they clearly feel like these questions are not being answered and they don't have the information they need. But the governor said, nope, I'm going to veto this so that you don't need that information. The irony is that the governor did support and actually was already spending money before it was even in the budget on a study on what happens if we tear down the Snake River dams. Well, this study has been done numerous times, right? The Congressman Simpson has a $33.5 billion proposal that he says he studied what would happen. The federal agencies have looked at what would happen if we tore down the Snake River dams. The governor did another study a couple of years ago about tearing down the Snake River dams. But we now have a new one because those didn't come up with the answers that he wants. So he has a new study to say, okay, well, now I want to study what happens if we actually do this. So the fact that other studies have been done, the fact that other people have looked at this didn't matter in that instance. He wants the study and he's going to rush it so that it's done by May or June. But when it comes to ensuring the stability of our grid and that there's enough electricity with increased renewables, he says, well, no, we don't need that because other people are looking at that. It's clear that what he cares about is he's trying to engineer the result. He doesn't want to hear the results about grid instability because he's worried about what it may reveal. Whereas with the Snake River dams, he didn't get the answers that he wanted before. So he's going to do another study to try to generate that answer. So that's the approach that governor has taken when it comes to environmental studies and environmental data during this legislative session.
No, I remember we had you on this program, a few months ago. We talked about some of the predicted grid instability for Washington state based on growth of population and increased use of energy. And that's assuming that there were not additional hydroelectric dam energy generating dams taken down. If you would, can you recap what challenges the Washington state electrical grid faces? And I mean, why do we even need a study on grid stability if we already know that there's an instability coming, if you catch my drift?
So the Northwest Power and Conservation Council does the research on grid stability and the chance of what they call loss of load probability, which doesn't mean that there'll be blackouts, it just means there'll be shortages. And you can deal with those shortages in a variety of ways. Blackouts is one of them, but it's not the only one. So they did a study a little over a year ago that found that we had an increasing chance of loss of load probability and that currently it was too high. They re-looked at the study and what they found is that the chance is actually lower than they expected, which is good news. But the reason that they found that is because they said hydropower is more adaptable, more flexible than they previously had modeled. So our dams, what it meant is that our dams are more valuable than we previously appreciated. So the irony is that some of the people who were saying, oh, look, there's a lower chance of blackouts, there's less concern about adding more renewables onto the system because there's lower risk of blackout. Forgot the part that you shouldn't tear down the dams. So the Snake River dams are a little bit different than like Grand Coulee. Grand Coulee has a big reservoir, and so they have a lot of flexibility when they run run water through it to create power. The Snake River dams are what are called a run of river. So they go through and you can delay the water a little bit, but you can't, hold it for days and days and days. But it doesn't matter because what happens over the course of a day is that electricity goes up in the morning, then goes down in the middle of the day, and then peaks in the evening. And what you need to be able to do is just shift the electrical supply a little bit over the course of the day to meet those ups and downs of electrical demand. I do that with solar. In fact, solar actually drops off right as demand is going up in the early evening, and wind is primarily at night when there's very little demand. So that's what we face is that the new report said that although there is a lower risk of blackouts, the value of hydro is higher than they had appreciated before, and that removing Snake River dams or other dams like the environmental community has talked about is even more risky.
Is there, what are the odds of, I mean, how do we make the grid bigger? I mean, how do we add power to the grid if we're going to eliminate hydroelectric possibility? And we know that the wind and solar, the wind's obviously too unstable. Solar, we're in the worst place in basically the continental United States to have a reliance on solar here. So, what are Washington State's options, really?
So there are good and bad options. The first one is don't tear down any dams. The second, because of our laws, the problem is that nobody wants to build any more natural gas plants because they can't guarantee that the energy that they are providing will still be purchased 15 years from now, right? They need to make a long-term commitment. And if the state is saying, okay, we need it for a little while, but 10, 15 years from now, we may cut you off. Who wants to make that bet? It's very difficult to make that bet.
Right, because you have such a huge capital outlay to create a facility.
So another option is batteries. Batteries are extremely expensive. The fact is dams are essentially giant batteries, right? All that water is just energy waiting, or waiting to turn into energy. It's just a giant battery. But electrical batteries are very expensive. California uses them. But even at their highest, they only about 3% of their power comes from stored energy from batteries. And they've spent a huge amount of money on those. So batteries are going to be very expensive and very difficult to replace. When you look at the models, what you see is that the plans are basically to put solar in southern Idaho and wind in Montana because the wind blows a little bit different time of the day in Montana, and southern Idaho is sunnier. So what we're talking about is tearing down dams here and then giving jobs to Idaho and Montana to replace the jobs that we have lost. There are good options, and one of the good options is to get individuals more involved. The problem we have right now is that all of this discussion is planners making plans for how you will do things. And the people who are out of it, right? It's the utilities, it's the government making plans, and consumers are not really at the table. We need to change that. We have technology to change that in the form of smart thermostats. A thing called Sense that I had in my house, which tells me how much electricity I'm using and where I'm using it. So it gives me incentives and information to shift demand. And if I can simply shift demand from those peak hours, like 5 to 8 p.m. into the middle of the day or into the evening when costs are lower and there's more supply, that helps a lot too. But we've got to get the consumer in this, because otherwise you're just relying on politicians and planners to make the right decisions. And we know that they don't always make those right decisions, and then the costs are paid by consumers.
So that's, that sounds more hopeful than I expected. Although it's a much bigger task than one would guess, to get people, particularly in positions of power, to think of turning decision making over to others. It's kind of like, the whole argument of the free market is all these other individual decisions are going to give us information that we wouldn't otherwise know, and you'll never be able to calculate it all, because there's these micro pockets of information all flowing through to create something new, that invisible hand. And government hates that because it's much less messy and less risky, so to speak, to say, this is what we're doing and this is our plan.
The one thing about turning power over from politicians to people is that it will also reduce healthcare costs, because the number of the opportunities for politicians to pat themselves on the back and break their arm for doing the right thing is much reduced, right? They don't get to take credit for everything, but that's why they want to, right? They want to plan everything so that they can take credit and say, hey, I did this, look how good I am. And if their policy is instead to say, you know what, I'm going to let you decide, you can do what you want to do, it's very hard to take credit for the results when you actually give freedom to other people. But that's basically what that is our philosophy of government, right? That's what the United States was built on, is that people get to make the choices about their own life. It's not, people are not just, sort of playthings for the government to build the utopia that they want to force us into.
Now, I saw also, and I know this wasn't, big on our schedule, Todd, but you also mentioned a success for Washington State and environment and the environment. This is one of those successes that our state refuses to acknowledge, which is exceedingly rare. Almost all of our metrics, well, I shouldn't say almost, every metric that we've set for climate change policy, for example, has gone nowhere. But we actually have a metric to measure success with a certain animal population. We've achieved it, and seemingly few people want to acknowledge that. Why don't you describe what that is, Todd?
So it's the irony, right? Which is that Washington politicians constantly claim that we're leaders on climate change, even as we fail to meet all of our climate targets. But on wolves, where the population has gone up year after year, and we are now basically where they predicted the populations would be to classify as recovery and delisting, the governor instead is saying we need more restrictions on ranchers and other things like that. So there is an inverse relationship between how well we are actually doing on an environmental issue and what the governor and politicians seem to think. So the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife released their report for the 2021 population of wolves. Population was up again 16%. There are 19 breeding pairs, and 33 packs. All of those were the highest ever. The rule for delisting says that there have to be at least 15 breeding pairs for 3 years. We have had that now. We've had it for 4 years. We've had 15, 15, 16, and 19 in 2021. And when you look at the original 2011 management plan, they said, when we get to about 200 wolves statewide, we'll probably be close to delisting. We are over 200 wolves, but we are nowhere close to delisting. And the reason is that those wolves have to be spread out across Washington State. They're not. They're basically all in one corner of the state. Why? Because there's very nice habitat there and a lot of food, and they feel like sticking in that area. A few of them have moved to the North Cascades region, but none have moved to the Southwest Washington region. And the delisting plan requires 6 breeding pairs to be in Southwest Washington before we can delist. It's going to be a very long time before we get there. So what ends up happening is that we have a ton of wolves, so many that the Colville Confederated tribes, which are in the Northeast Washington, consider the wolves recovered, that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife considers wolves recovered in Eastern Washington. Only Washington State doesn't consider them recovered in Eastern Washington. And the result is that the ranchers in Northeast Washington are paying the cost, because there are lots of wolves, lots of wolf attacks on livestock and things like that. So they are paying all of the costs, or virtually all of the costs, for wolf recovery. Wolf recovery is a great thing, but we should acknowledge it, and we should acknowledge the costs. And rather than sticking with a management plan that has made an assumption about wolves dispersing across the state that has turned out to be totally wrong, we ought to adjust our thinking and say, look, we need wolves to move out of this area. They're not. Let's deal with the problem that we do have in this area. Agree with what the Colville tribe says, what the federal government says, and delist them in Eastern Washington, and then work on, getting them to move to other parts of the state.
I can see a huge problems ahead for well, not only the ranchers, but the wolves themselves too, because animosity will grow as the wolf population gets larger and larger if there's more conflict. And, I've hunted in places in Idaho where, the wolf population was very successful coming back, and too successful because it led to depletion of deer and elk in that area. And locals were very upset about it, understandably so. So what are the options? How do you introduce wolves to Southwest Washington to change this? Or does it require what you were talking about? Does it require changing the delisting process to do it by region? Or is there some way that they could, tranquilize wolves and move them over there, to speed this along according to the rules or metrics as they currently have them?
They have ruled out transferring them for a variety of reasons. I'm not a biologist, but they have said that they need to disperse naturally, and they are to some extent into the North Cascades, which is another region. So there is some, but they are stubbornly clinging to an area that has very good habitat and lots of food, which shouldn't be entirely surprising. So I think what we need to do is to deal with the problem that we have right now, which is that there are too many wolves in one part of the state and that they're causing an adverse impact. In the most extreme situation, the result that some people will choose is the 3 S's: shoot, shovel, and shut up. Right? If wolves are constantly attacking your livestock, people will take it into their own hands, bury them, and not say anything. We don't want that. When it gets to that point, it has gone way too far. And there's a lot of frustration. There is no need for us to get to that level and for us to be stubborn about not changing the rules. We are seeing big increases year after year in the population. They're moving in the right direction. It is so funny to hear the Center for Biological Diversity and other environmental groups, and the governor who echoes this and says that he agrees with them, saying the Center for Biological Diversity sent out something last year that said that the Department of Fish and Wildlife won't be happy until every last wolf is dead. It is totally, it's a fantasy land that they live in, that Department of Fish and Wildlife is killing wolves at any sort of, meaningful rate. The population is exploding. So we need to deal with reality and what's going on. But extremists, I think, unfortunately, are dictating what we're doing and making it impossible to deal with what everyone should acknowledge as a problem. And that's why, even in the face of very good numbers, the governor and others refuse to claim victory and refuse to say things are moving in the right direction. Because if they say that, then they can't continue to claim that there is a crisis that requires more restrictions.
I'm not laughing because I'm happy. It's just one of those so sad it's funny and pathetic kinds of things. Let's turn now and bring Jason Mercier back and turn now and have our Q&A time. This is your chance to ask questions of either Todd or Jason. I'll try and alternate where possible. Jason, the first question is for you. Why doesn't the Douglas County judge hold the state in contempt of court if the state continues to pursue the establishment of its tax collecting bureaucracy?
That's a great question. And it would require going back to him and making that motion, pointing out the state is ignoring the ruling. Right now, it's just costing taxpayers more money because that tax is not due until April of next year. Obviously, it's creating uncertainty, but you could conceivably, if the Department of Revenue were to try to collect this tax before the Supreme Court or the Court of Appeals is made a final determined ruling, that might be a motion you see happening in the future.
Thanks, Jason. Next question. This is for you, Todd, and there's 3 of them, so I'm going to combine them all. They're somewhat related. John wants to know why are we not talking about nuclear energy? Another, where do you see the role of nuclear in the mix of the all of the above strategy? Some all caps there to put an emphasis on frustration. And John adds that he says, comparing all sources of energy, metrics show nuclear power is at least dangerous. I've used to work in the state Senate. I know Senator Brown at the time from the Tri-Cities area frequently brought up the possibilities of nuclear power and its possibilities. Why is that off the table still, and why is it so so little talked about as far as a strategy to create energy in Washington?
The biggest problem with nuclear, at least in Washington State, is the permitting time. And so the challenge of permitting a new nuclear power plant or new supply is so daunting that there's not a lot of discussion on it. There is discussion of what is called modular nuclear reactors, and modular nuclear reactors are much smaller. They're much newer technology, and they have one advantage, which is that nuclear reactors are base load, which means that you turn them on and they are just flat. They just constantly produce energy. Electricity, which is great, but electricity goes up, demand goes up and down during the day. So nuclear produces with the base load, and then you sort of deal with the fluctuations with other types of electricity, natural gas, and hydro in Washington State. What modular nuclear reactors can do is that they can do some of that demand following, because if you have 10 small reactors, you can turn them on and off as you need to meet that demand. So we are talking about it, but of course the permitting still takes a very long time. So Idaho National Labs in Eastern Idaho is working on a modular nuclear reactor test, but that isn't going to start until middle of this decade, maybe even later in this decade. So it is part of the discussion, but the lead times to get that done are so long that it's going to be a while.
One of the more interesting conversations that I heard in Olympia was talking about that, and even though some of their, I think, polling at the time, showed public still very concerned about nuclear because it's just a buzzword that scares people in many ways. They pointed out that there's been nuclear reactors in the Seattle area for a long time, and that was the Navy vessels going, back and forth all the time. So even though there are a lot of people thinking, this would be deadly, we can't possibly have this in our area, there are nuclear reactors in the greater Puget Sound area on a regular basis and have been for decades there.
Well, and Seattle City Light uses more nuclear power than wind power. So Seattle City Light calls itself the greenest utility in the country. But how many people in Seattle would realize that more of their energy comes from nuclear than it does from wind? I don't think very many.
It's that Hulk radiation green, the glow from the old TV series there. All right, next question is for Jason. Jason, can they include the word illegal in the ballot title on that initiative since this income tax has been ruled unconstitutional?
Yeah, that's probably a bridge too far. I mean, what the judge should do is what the campaign recommended and just call it a tax on capital gains income, because the ballot titles are not supposed to prejudice one way or another. I mean, the reality is that's what this tax is, but I don't think I would ever see a Thurston County Superior Court judge popping that into a ballot title.
Next question, are losses of services related to a tax being illegal, like claiming added environmental benefits from not logging state forests?
So I think this was directed to me, but I'm going to actually let Todd answer this because he can update what DNR is doing.
So the Department of Natural Resources is taking an area of timber that was previously protected for marbled murrelet, which is now no longer necessary. The science has said we don't need to protect it for marbled murrelet. And instead of harvesting it and generating revenue for schools, they are going to sell it for carbon offsets. And the theory is that you let the trees grow, they absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere, stored as carbon in the tree, and therefore you're helping reduce the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. There are a number of problems with this. First is that the value of those carbon offsets is far below what they would be as timber. So you're losing money for school construction. The second thing is that what all the science says is that over the long term and probably even medium term, maybe even short term, the better way to sequester carbon, the better way to get CO2 out of the atmosphere using forests is to harvest trees at maturity, turn them into products, houses, furniture, things like that store the carbon in that wood, and then replant a forest that starts absorbing more new CO2. The other thing that that does is that makes wood relatively more attractive as a building material because it drives down prices the more supply you put on the market compared to very energy intensive building materials like steel and concrete. Can't build everything with wood, but if you can build it with wood, that's a much more environmentally friendly building product. So if you actually care about CO2, the way to manage those forests is sustainably by harvesting them, turning them into products, and then restarting the process over. When I was at the Department of Natural Resources, we did analysis on this and found that about 60-year harvest rotation for Western Washington is where the growth curves start to go down, and that you want to harvest and start that process over again. So whether you're talking about money or whether you're talking about carbon dioxide, the approach of selling carbon offsets, I think, is misguided. I'll just add one last thing, which is the assumption is that by simply letting trees grow, that the demand for wood products is going to go away. Demand for products does not go away. So what you often end up having happen is that you stop harvesting here, and a harvest that wouldn't have otherwise occurred will now harvest over here. CO2 is important globally, not just locally. And so on a global scale, if all you're doing is saying we're not going to harvest here and we're going to harvest here instead, you've literally done nothing in terms of reducing CO2 worldwide. And so that's why I think this is kind of a Ponzi scheme that doesn't make a lot of sense. But the purpose is to find an excuse to stop harvesting for environmentalists. And so that this is the excuse they've come up with.
Jason, this question's for you. It's why, with all of the additional money that came into the lap of the legislature this session, and you can remind people about exactly how many billions more we've brought in this state based on our tax system as it is, than we were expected to be able to spend. We got no tax relief coming up despite 40-year inflation highs. Shouldn't there be a reminder that we had the opportunity to alleviate some of the burden, some of the expense on taxpayers, instead of only talk about what possible new taxes they might be able to achieve?
That's a great question. And actually, that's a project that I'm working on right now. I'm just looking at what we're going to call the Democratic trifecta states. Those are the 14 states with Democratic governors and Democratic legislatures. And as I've been going through, I've contacted the revenue directors for these states, and you'll not be surprised that Washington is standing out as being perhaps the only one, not only among this subset of Democratic trifecta states, but nationally, that has provided zero broad-based tax relief, not just this year, but over the past 2 years. And it's $10.5 billion. $10.5 billion is how much more came in since the last budget was adopted before the supplemental. So if you were ever going to provide any type of tax relief, this was the time to do it. And let me just tell you some of the headlines just in this past week. California, billions of dollars of tax rebates. New Mexico, tax rebates. Hawaii, tax rebates. What do those three states have in common? They're all run by Democrats who have realized that we need to provide some type of return back to the citizens, not only because we're getting more of their money, but they're getting hammered with inflation and need help with those costs. Every word except for Washington.
It's amazing to me. Todd, this question's for you. Well, it's more of a statement than a question, but it reminded me, I thought it was a joke at first, and then I vaguely recalled you mentioning something about new requirements for equity and geographic equity. The comment was, wolves are like solar panel subsidies. There needs to be geographic equity. Now, it's kind of a funny statement, but isn't it true that our environmental policy has suddenly taken on this idea that equity is a good idea in all areas, even if it doesn't make sense, like putting solar panels in forks, for example?
Well, there is good habitat across the state, but the problem is that we don't have equity. Joel Kretz proposed a bill that would put wolves on Bainbridge Island, but nobody seemed very excited about that, especially the people on Bainbridge Island. So, the problem is that there is this imbalance. It's good that we have more wolves. It's not good that they're all in one location. So getting them to spread out is the challenge. But like I said, the thing that we have to recognize is that our original assumptions about what would happen have turned out to be wrong. If you stick with the plan, even when your assumptions are wrong, you're going to cause problems. There are going to be trade-offs. We're seeing those trade-offs. And if you don't address them, there's going to be a problem. So, and there's no reason. I mean, the other thing is that you can find a way to deal with the legitimate concerns of ranchers in the Northeast part of the state without undermining wolf recovery. And the fact that people won't do that or are resistant to do that just shows this is not about problem solving. It's about sort of an extreme vision of how things should be, rather than the science and the reality. So it's very frustrating.
I have one attendee who's kindly said the word I was looking for earlier when I used manpower, so politically incorrectly, the word I was looking for is labor, which they say is genderless. But I looked up the origin here, and it's either from childbirth, which would be intrinsically feminine, or from manual labor, which is also problematic. So no matter which way I went there, no matter which way I go, I'm going to be in trouble. So I'll just leave it at that. Let's see, one more question here, Todd. This is kind of a lengthy one. The news media has written the vocabulary for climate change. Why are we collectively buying into the premise that the minuscule amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the cause? The real cause is in fact unknown. The hockey stick showing the correlation between the rise in temperature and carbon dioxide was faked. Correlation does not equal cause. Climate change over millions of years placed jungles in Alaska that resulted in the organic oil that's there today. If the goal was to eliminate carbon emissions, which should be called oxygen emissions, we'd be nuclear power driven, as is China today. Let's face it, some politicians just want to spend money, and it provides an unlimited spending and taxing opportunity. You want to respond to that comment?
Sure. So here's what we know. We know very simply that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, as well as methane and some others, but CO2 is the primary one. And what that means is that when the earth heats, the sun heats the earth, a certain amount of that energy is re-radiated back out into space in the form of primarily infrared radiation, the lowest end. CO2 blocks some of that infrared radiation, meaning that we have more energy in the atmosphere than we otherwise would have. So we know that CO2 tends to increase temperatures and increase the amount of energy in the system over time. What we have a harder time with is exactly how much and what that means. And so the analogy that I give is that it's like driving a car downhill. Part of what you're doing downhill is human caused with your foot on the gas, and part of it is nature, which is gravity. And so absolutely, temperatures have changed a lot. Long before there was the first SUV, temperatures started rising in 1860, and there were very few SUVs in 1860. So we can't discount that portion of it. But we do know that there is some risk from CO2 and climate change. The problem is that climate change has become, as the questioner points out, sort of a useful tool to do all sorts of things. When Al Gore won his Nobel Prize for his advocacy of climate change, he said, climate change is a good reason to do things we should be doing anyway, right? So they admit that it is a tool to change society. The Green New Deal, the supporters specifically said that they were using climate change to change society and institute socialism. So yeah, I think, that I understand a lot of the skepticism. I have a lot of the skepticism myself. This morning, the Vancouver Columbian claimed that the snow that we're having in Washington State right now is evidence of climate change. It's insane. People just make things up. And the reason that they call it a climate crisis because they want to create a crisis mentality so that we don't ask too much about the solutions, right? When you're in a crisis, it's like, we don't have time to think, just do things. That is a totally wrong mentality. So what our approach needs to be is to recognize the risk that does exist, not exaggerate it, but also not say it's zero, and find ways to deal with that empower people, not politicians. That's our approach. What I talked about earlier, giving people more control over their electricity. You can reduce your costs by shifting demand out of peak hours, and you can take advantage of solar and wind and also reduce your the CO2 emissions associated with your electricity. There are lots of options like that. So I totally agree with the questioner, with the premise of the questioner, saying that climate change has become a political tool for left-wing agendas. That doesn't mean that it's not worth addressing. It means that it is worth addressing in a way that is more responsible. And conservatives ought to have, and people who believe in the free market ought to have the confidence that free market is the best way to solve environmental problems. And we see that again and again. And it is the best way to improve efficiency and reduce environmental impact, whether that's climate change or other things like that.
I can always tell when someone's serious about concern about climate change versus somebody who is using it for a political leverage, political tool. Because when Todd brings up a method, or a problem in an environmental policy that could be changed to make it better, and they get mad and insult Todd and WPC, I know that their real concern is about some kind of political payoff, a political thing. Otherwise, they should be excited about the opportunity to be able to make a greater change with less resources so that people would be able to benefit from that. The next question is for you, Jason. Is Washington the only state that hasn't had tax relief because there's no income tax?
No, you've seen Florida cut taxes, Texas cut taxes. Nevada, I'm still trying to confirm, and Nevada is a state without an income tax, but it hasn't been because of the tax structure. It's been because of the mindset that in Washington state, that money is theirs to spend. It's not ours to be returned. That's the difference between Washington nationally.
And finally, Todd, what's the outlook for fires and the Department of Natural Resources capability to fight them this year?
It's hard to say. We always used to, when I worked at the Department of Natural Resources, we used to joke that a dry winter meant a big fire season. We also used to say that a wet winter meant a big fire season, because then you'd get lots of growth that were fuel for fires. So there's a lot of variability in what causes and how the fire season turns out, weather, all sorts of other things like that. The number one problem we face, though, is unhealthy forests. You will hear, every time we have a fire, you will hear people blame climate change. U.S. Forest Service did a very good study over the course of a decade of what caused increase in fire. And by far, the number one cause was unhealthy forests that are either dead or dying and are basically standing matchsticks. They said that climate change could be associated with about 12% of the increase, whereas unhealthy forests were more than half of the increase. So we have lots to do in that area. So if we have a dry summer, if we have hot weather again, we have a lot of forests that could burn. So it is hard, but it's hard to predict how that will turn out. DNR, they are, I think that they're adequately funded. The challenge is that we have, the way we fund and the way we deal with fires is that they basically say, go fight, do what you need to do to put out fires, and then send us the bill later. So they have a little bit of carte blanche. And I don't think that we are short on resources. I think, in fact, probably what we should be doing is finding resources to prevent fires rather than having to fight them after the fact. So I'm more worried about the status of our forests than I am the status of our ability to fight forest fires.
Thanks, Todd. Well, that about wraps it up for today. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in and listening. And I want to remind you, if you appreciated the information that you got today, if you value this as I do, I always feel smarter at having heard from Todd and Jason. I suggest, getting a membership to Washington Policy Center, getting a friend a membership, or a neighbor or a family member, and getting involved with Washington Policy Center and supporting that work that way, and making sure that this information doesn't stay in this bubble, but spreads out, because it's good news for Washington State. There are ways to solve our problems that don't increase the costs on families, that don't increase the burdens on taxpayers, and that achieve better results. So there's a lot of good news with Washington Policy Center, and we want to share that with you. We'll see you in 2 weeks with Washington Policy on the Go. Thank you to Todd Myers and Jason Mercier, our center directors who joined us today. And thank you for supporting Washington Policy Center.